Chapter 5. The Spooky Drawbridge. "Do you know that man?" George queried. Nancy thought hard, but could not remember who he was. "His face certainly does look familiar. Maybe it will come to me later. Let's follow him and see if we can find out who he is." George's meal was quickly paid for, and the girls hurried to the street. The stranger for whom they were searching was nowhere in sight. The young sleuths peered into various shops that were still open and looked up and down cross streets. The man had vanished. "Well, we may as well go home," said Nancy. "I confess I'm ready for bed." "Me too," said Bess, yawning. On the way back to the motel, Nancy said she would like to visit the castle early the next morning. "That place intrigues me. It probably holds a mystery." "I thought we were trying to find Joanie Horton," Bess spoke up. "Don't tell me you think she's being hidden in the castle." Nancy laughed. "No, not after all these years. I suggest we go to the castle before breakfast. Then we can start our sleuthing at the banks and those lawyers' offices." The three friends were up early. On the way to the parking area, they stopped to gaze at the view of the valley. The sun was not very high yet, and sections beneath the hills were in deep shadow. The castle, however, stood out clearly. Suddenly, Nancy called out excitedly, "Girls, the drawbridge is down now!" "But the place is supposed to be empty," Bess said. "It's positively spooky." The others agreed and stared at the spot, puzzled. Why was the bridge in this position? Who had lowered it? "Maybe it just fell," Nancy suggested. "Could be," George said. "Or maybe some sightseers were there, walked over the dry moat, and then let the drawbridge down so they could go back across it." "It's a logical explanation," Nancy agreed. "Well, shall we go?" The girls climbed into Nancy's convertible, and she wound down the hillside to the town. Not many people were in evidence in Deep River, and the visitors knew the restaurants would not be open yet. "I know I'm going to be famished before we get back," Bess declared. "It won't hurt you," said George, surveying Bess's plump figure. Bess made a face but did not retort. She sat in silence as Nancy covered mile after mile. "I had no idea the castle was so far from the business district," she remarked. Finally, they reached the grass-overgrown lane which led into the property. "Tire tracks," George pointed out. "Somebody has been here recently." Nancy parked at the side of the lane some distance from the moat. The tracks of the other car went on to the drawbridge. "I think we'd better proceed on foot," she said. The girls alighted and walked forward. "I'm glad the bridge is down," said Bess. "I'd hate to plod deep into that moat and up again on the other side." Suddenly Nancy, who was in the lead, cried out, "There's water in the moat! A lot of it!" The cousins hurried forward to look over the edge with Nancy. "It looks deep, too," she added. "It's not just rainwater." Bess was fearful. "Who put it in if nobody's living here?" Nancy admitted that she was puzzled, but was eager to continue the trek over to the castle itself. Before the girls could start, the bridge began to rise. "Oh!" Bess screamed. "The castle is haunted! A ghost must be raising the drawbridge." "Don't be silly," George scolded her. "The townspeople and the police may think this place is unoccupied, but it's my guess somebody is hiding here." Nancy, who long ago had made it a rule never to side with either of the cousins when they were disagreeing, said, "One thing is sure. If we expect to get across now, we'll have to swim. Let's go back to town, have breakfast, do our calling at the banks and lawyers, then come back here wearing our bathing suits." Bess did not comment on the suggestion, but it was evident from the expression on her face that she did not relish the adventure. As they walked to the car, the three friends kept turning around to see if they could catch a glimpse of anyone on the castle grounds. Nobody appeared. The place seemed to be deserted. "I wonder if more than one person is hiding at the castle," said Nancy. George remarked that there must be more than one person. The bridge had been let down for a car to go over, and someone inside the castle walls apparently had pulled up the drawbridge. "Oh dear," said Bess. "This is getting terribly complicated. Why don't we leave the castle out of our sleuthing?" The other girls did not answer her. Both Nancy and George were curious to see what was going on in the abandoned spot. Why had water been put into the moat, and by whom? Had it been done to keep people out of the castle? As soon as the girls reached Deep River, they went to the brass kettle, but it was not open. They turned around and walked back to the main street and entered a modern diner. Their breakfast proved to be delicious, and Bess's good humor returned. By the time the girls had finished eating, the stores and offices were open. Nancy headed for the Deep River National Bank. Bess and George were always interested in observing Nancy's sleuthing procedures. They often wondered whether it was her charm, her straightforward manner, or her businesslike approach that unfailingly gained her entrance to the offices of officials. Now, with little explanation on her part, the girls were ushered into the president's office. Mr. Cleet was a pleasant man, but one who repeatedly was interrupted by telephone calls and messengers. He listened attentively, however, to Nancy's request for information about the deceased Mrs. Adelaide Horton. "I'm afraid there is little I can tell you," the man replied. "I knew Mrs. Horton only slightly. One day she came in and closed out both her checking and her savings accounts. Then she went to her safe deposit box and removed the contents, apparently securities." "She gave no explanation?" Nancy asked. "None whatever. She was not a talkative person. Furthermore, we never question what our clients do. Of course, we were sorry to lose her accounts." "How long ago was it?" Nancy queried. Mr. Cleet thought for a few moments, then said, "I can't remember exactly how many years ago, but it was a few months before her death." At that moment, Mr. Cleet's buzzer sounded. He answered and said, "All right, put him on." The president turned to the girls. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me now. I have an important long-distance call." Nancy arose hastily and thanked him. She hurried from the room, followed by Bess and George. When they reached the sidewalk, George asked, "Nancy, do you think that you learned anything important?" "Indeed I do. I've had a feeling all along that something strange was happening between Mrs. Horton and the couple who worked for her. I'm beginning to think that maybe the servants were using some hypnotic influence over Mrs. Horton to get her money and securities away from her." "How perfectly dreadful," Bess commented. Nancy walked up the street, telling the girls she was going to visit the other bank in town. At this institution, the girl detective was told a similar story to the one she had just heard, but the information came from the head cashier. He was the only person who had been working at the bank 15 years before. This man was a little more talkative and revealed the fact that Mrs. Horton was considered to be wealthy. "I believe she left everything to a granddaughter," he said, "but the details have slipped my memory." Nancy was sorry to hear this, because for a moment she had hoped that the man would supply a helpful clue. He smiled. "Mrs. Horton never talked about her personal affairs to anyone. She didn't seem to want a soul to know her business." Nancy, realizing that the cashier could throw no further light on the mystery, thanked him, and the girls left the bank. Their next stop was at one of the law offices. Here the young sleuths learned nothing. The two lawyers who shared the office had been in town less than 5 years and had never heard of Mrs. Horton. At the next attorney's, Nancy had a little better luck. The man had heard of Mrs. Horton, and although he knew nothing about her personally, he said, "I believe a Mr. John Wheeler, who is now retired, took care of her estate." "Does he live in town?" Nancy asked eagerly. "Yes, on Victoria Street. I don't know the number of the house, but you can't miss it. On the front lawn there's a huge statue of a dog." As the girls hurried toward Mr. Wheeler's home, Nancy wondered if this was the man to whom her father had referred and who was reported to be out of town. She fervently hoped he was back. To her delight, Mr. Wheeler had returned, and he welcomed the girls cordially. He was about 70 years old, but very spry-looking. "It's rare that even one young lady comes to call on me," he said with a lilt in his voice. "To have 3 all at once, and such attractive ones, is a great pleasure indeed. Do come in and sit down." The girls seated themselves in the spacious, beautifully furnished living room. Nancy apologized for the intrusion, then introduced herself as the daughter of Carson Drew, the attorney. "I believe you settled the estate of Mrs. Adelaide Horton?" Nancy said questioningly. "Yes, I did." Nancy said that her father had come to Deep River looking for Mr. Wheeler, but had learned he was out of town. "My father had to take a business trip, so he asked me to come up here and make some inquiries." "And what is it you want to know?" Mr. Wheeler asked, his voice now showing a note of suspicion. "It's about Mrs. Horton's granddaughter, to whom she left her money." "Well," Mr. Wheeler lifted his eyebrows, "everything was in order. Just before Mrs. Horton's death, she left a note giving the address of her granddaughter. The girl was notified and came here from New York City. Her lawyer accompanied her. She had full credentials to prove who she was." After a pause, Mr. Wheeler added, "So she inherited Mrs. Horton's estate. That's all there is to the story." "But she couldn't have," Bess blurted. "She was only 3 years old." Mr. Wheeler smiled affably. "Oh, no," he said. "She was 21. Nancy, Bess, and George were stunned. "Where is Joanie Horton now?" Nancy asked. "I have no idea," the retired lawyer answered. Nancy's mind was in a whirl. If Mr. Wheeler's story were true, who were the Mr. and Mrs. Bowen that had come to Mr. Drew? Were they imposters? If so, what was their scheme? On the other hand, Nancy reflected, maybe a great hoax had been perpetrated, and an impostor had received the estate. A similar thought went through George's mind. She asked abruptly, "Mr. Wheeler, weren't you suspicious about that girl who claimed to be Joanie Horton?" The former lawyer's face instantly turned red, then almost purple. He jumped from his chair and in anger shouted, "How dare you, young lady? The idea of questioning my integrity! I suggest that you and your friends leave at once." End of chapter 5.